Well, I expressed joy for the young man who was to be baptized and commended them for leading him to Christ. Then I asked Tom this question. Tom, in your association with these girls on the beach in their bathing suits, did you ever find evil or impure thoughts coming into your mind because of the way they were dressed? Tom dropped his head for just a moment and then answered, "Yes, of course I did." Immediately the girls chorused their dismay. "Why didn't you tell us then?" one of them asked. They seemed genuinely surprised that the boys had not come up to them at the beach to tell them their suits were provocative. They went away that day wiser young women, but do you think they forthwith gave up their custom of mixed bathing? I found that in most cases the ladies do not change their dress styles even after learning how detrimental their influence. The goddess of fashion is a tyrant ruler, and few are committed enough to yield their darling indulgences, especially when the attire caters to the self-nature. Dr. Harold Shryock gives this counsel to young dating couples, and this is taken from the Youth Instructor of July 19, 1960. Avoid mixed swimming. Swimming of itself is a wholesome recreation. But when members of both sexes swim together, there is introduced an element of personal display which, for any normal human being, directs the thoughts toward the physical characteristics peculiar to the opposite sex. The effort of mixed swimming is to make commonplace those considerations that for the Christian are sacred. Mixed swimming tends to lower personal standards of decorum, making physical familiarity seem less objectionable. End of quote. In the March 1971 issue of Ministry magazine, a letter to the editor was printed which is worthy of wide distribution. The letter was written by Don Hawley, editor of Life and Health magazine. Here's what he wrote. In the January 1970 issue of the Ministry, one of our ministers wrote concerning the matter of modesty. He pointed out that our criticism of the miniskirt did not seem to correlate with our complete lack of concern about mixed bathing. He, along with the editors, asked that others express their opinion on the subject, but there has followed a strange silence. Is it possible that we know intuitively that mixed bathing is not proper, but since it is so universally practiced by the church, it seems best to ignore the situation? If so, this is a head-in-the-sand approach. No matter how universal some impropriety may be, we still have to answer individually in the judgment. Perhaps there were those who did have convictions, but who felt it would not be politically expedient to express them. I once heard a conference president downgrade a particular pastor because he's rather fanatical. He doesn't believe in mixed bathing. Yes, we decry the wearing of shorts, the backless back and plunging neckline, and the miniskirt, pointing out that such people are half naked. But if that person switches to a condition of being three-quarters naked, that is, into swimwear, then all is well. Apparently, if we want to do something badly enough, such as engage in mixed bathing, then the laws of modesty can be temporarily abrogated. Until a few years ago, at least, a person leaving a public beach in swimming attire and walking a block to a shopping area would risk arrest for indecent exposure. Isn't it a bit strange that what the world labels indecent, the church finds acceptable? In one conference, the following regulations are enforced during camp meeting. Swimmers are requested to use bathing caps and to be properly and modestly dressed going to and from the pool. Street clothes or bathing robes are required. Think about this for a moment. The unavoidable inference is that once one gets to the pool, it will be all right to wear only bathing attire and be immodestly dressed. End of quotation. Well, some have asked whether Ellen G. White spoke on the subject of mixed bathing. According to the White estate, there is no record of such counsel. Obviously, the wearing of bikinis and skimpy bathing suits was not any problem under the Victorian aura of the mid-1800s. When I wrote for information on the subject from the White estate, they sent me a copy of a letter which had been written to somebody who had made a similar inquiry. The secretary of the estate wrote the letter December 8, 1953, and here I am now quoting from that letter. The question of mixed bathing, about which you wrote some time ago, is certainly a most difficult one to deal with under present-day conditions. Unfortunately, we have not a single statement in the writings of Ellen G. White in which the subject is mentioned directly. Conclusions must be based on principles stated in the Bible and the Spirit of prophecy rather than on any specific bit of instruction. Of course, this is true of many other subjects concerning which we must make decisions regularly. You asked about my convictions on the matter, so I shall pass them on with some of the statements of principle involved in reaching those conclusions. In dealing with a good many hundreds of young people during the years of my teaching, I have discovered what you have also found, that while it may be difficult to hold the line regarding some standards and activities, it's easier to hold than to back up after yielding to pressure to follow a course of action that's not clearly a right one. So far as I can learn, our colleges that have pools are still holding to separate periods for swimming. That is the position recommended by our Missionary Volunteer Department, and I believe the position is a sound one. You may be interested to know that the Missionary Volunteer Advisory Council, in its meeting just preceding the recent Autumn Council, emphatically reaffirmed its former position that we should not sponsor groups for mixed bathing. While the action does not specify all of the situations involved, the discussion centered in the church and MV Society, the school, and the camp. The men felt that circumstances warrant a strong reaffirmation of this point of view. Their observation has been that where some have not followed this course, most unfortunate results have obtained. You mentioned that our young people are beyond being shocked by anything they might see in connection with a swimming party. I believe that is true of many of them. One of my great questions is whether we as church leaders should sponsor things that will only serve to foster this tendency to be shock-proof. We must admit that repeated exposures to conscience-deadening influences have brought our young people to the condition in which we find them. Is it not our responsibility to do our best to avoid anything that will continue these influences? Rather than there being more reasons today for going ahead with mixed bathing than in the past, it seems that with the increased freedom of association and almost complete lack of inhibitions on the part of young people, the reasons for avoiding more freedom are multiplying. So far as the argument is concerned that people are so used to seeing immodesty that immodest bathing suits mean nothing to them, I believe that it is entirely fallacious. The Bible instruction is that Christians should be modestly dressed no matter what anyone else does. The fact that many consciences are hardened does not alter basic principles. It would require a rather ingenious individual to invent arguments to prove that the modern version of the bathing suit is modest apparel. While many refuse to admit it, for boys and men to be in close association with girls and women in the near state of nudity that the current bathing suit encourages is a very real source of temptation. All one needs to do is take a glance at some of the advertising matter for women's bathing suits to discover that it's the studied purpose of the manufacturers to focus male attention on the female form. For the church to encourage association on this basis is not a soul-winning endeavor. While it is true that many young people, especially the teenagers, consider us unrealistic in our approach to matters of this sort, that is not a new attitude. My contact with history has left me with a distinct impression that every generation of young people has considered its elders hopelessly out of date. As Christian parents and leaders, God has left it in our hands to teach our youth in such a way that while they may not fully agree with us at present, the time will come when they'll see the wisdom of our course. I've had many young people in later years thank me for prohibitions against which they chafed when they first encountered them. You mentioned that those who are interested in swimming parties do not support the other social activities of the church. However, if you should inaugurate church-sponsored swims, most of these individuals would still not support anything but the swims. They would not immediately gain interest in the other activities just because you had yielded to their urging in this matter. All this may sound as if I'm one of those ridiculously unrealistic persons of whom the young people speak. I assure you that this is not so. It is just that I have lived with young people every day for so many years that I've become exceedingly aware of the results when we yield to some of their unwise urgings. These days, we need to place before our young people every incentive for right thinking and acting. Mixed bathing is not such an incentive. Swimming is one of the best of all exercises, and certainly it's a proper physical activity for Christians when engaged in moderation and under the proper circumstances. If it is the physical benefit that is desired, this object can be gained by our sponsoring swims for young men and young women separately in appropriate places. I greatly miss the opportunity to go swimming as frequently as I would like because of the difficulty of finding suitable places for the recreation. I know many others who feel the same way, but our young people must learn to take a proper attitude toward denying present pleasures for future benefits. I sympathize with you and your problem. It is a perennial one in our schools, and I've been trying to cope with it for a dozen years. It seems to me that this is something that must be left as a decision for families to make. If consecrated parents decide that they wish to accompany their children as a family or as a group of families, certainly we should not condemn them. But for the church to sponsor swimming parties of this kind is an entirely different matter. And that's the end of the article quoted from Ministry Magazine. Now the chapter entitled Unisex. Any discussion of dress today would be incomplete without some consideration being given to the topic of unisex. One of the phenomena of our times is a mushrooming growth of look-alike boutiques and hair salons. Unisex shops and signs are appearing all across the country, offering exactly the same clothes and the same hairdos to both men and women. What is the significance of this development? Or are there any spiritual dangers inherent in this growing trend? First, we need to take note of the astronomical rise of homosexuality in the last few years. America has been literally swamped in a blitz of newspaper and magazine stories about the gay movement and how it has proudly come out of the closet to demand its rights. Gay marches and demonstrations attract great crowds and wide publicity. Television forums have openly discussed the matter before millions of viewers, with both lesbians and homosexuals taking part. Psychiatry has given formal recognition to the practice as normal sex behavior. Great Protestant church organizations are not only opening the doors to membership, but are ordaining self-professed homosexuals to the ministry. Churches have been established exclusively for the worship of homosexuals, and some marriages have been performed and legally registered between two persons of the same sex. Much has been written about the possible causes for this spectacular escalation of a very old perversion. Very few seem to understand exactly why it's made such a sudden resurgence, but I believe we can discover the reasons by examining some parallel social developments which have given explicit encouragement to the gay movement. There's a cause for every effect, and through the centuries of time, the same conditions have produced similar results. All Bible students are acquainted with the strong condemnation of sodomy, which is woven throughout both Old and New Testaments. God labels it as one of the worst abominations, a sin which will utterly deprave and destroy. The ancient pagan world was riddled with the vice. The very name is derived from the city of Sodom, which harbored a host of militant homosexuals. Paul speaks in Romans 1:26 and 27, quote, of vile affections, for even their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature. And likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one toward another, men with men, working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error which was meet. End quote. The reprobate minds which commit such things are worthy of death, Paul stated in verse 32. The land of Canaan, which the Israelites were to possess, was filled with the perverse iniquity of sodomy or homosexuality. This was one of the reasons God gave such explicit instructions for them not to intermarry or intermingle with the inhabitants of the land. They were to avoid any contaminating contacts which could lead Israel to join their debased practices. Furthermore, they were given specific instructions against dressing in a way that could create the climate for committing this sin. In Deuteronomy 22:5, God said, "The woman shall not wear that which pertaineth unto a man, neither shall a man put on a woman's garment, for all that do so are abomination unto the Lord thy God." Now, because sodomy involves a changing of sex roles, which is usually accompanied by a pattern of acting and dressing like the opposite sex, God warned his people not to open any door of temptation on this matter. They were to maintain clear lines of distinction between the dress of men and women. The New Testament reaffirms this principle of separation and appearance. Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 11:14 and 15, "Doth not even nature itself teach you that if a man have long hair, it is a shame unto him? But if a woman have long hair, it is a glory to her." Now, we're ready to make some observations about the modern social scene which could explain why we see the alarming rise of homosexuality. If God saw that the blurring of sexual identity could cause problems, then we must admit to having a great problem. We're seeing three factors at work today which have never operated before in human history at the same time. Taken alone, none of these three things would be too impressive. But when we see the combined effect of their influence, it is frightening even to contemplate. The three contemporary conditions are these. Number one, the women's lib movement. whose declared purpose is to interchange the roles of men and women in much of our social, economic, and religious life. Number two, the pantsuit fashion revolution, which has led the majority of women to abandon the traditional feminine dress styles. And number three, the growing tendency of men to dress in frills with feminine hairstyles and accompanying demasculinization. Now, this combination of related circumstances has probably been responsible for pushing thousands of borderline homosexuals over the line into perversion. Many of them only needed the little bit of psychotic confusion that the three popular movements thrust upon them. Dr. Charles Winnick, professor of sociology at the City University of New York, is one leading authority who feels that the current vogue for interchangeable clothing is leading us to ultimate disaster. In his provocative book, The New People, he delineates the numerous ways that unisex is desexualizing the American people. He believes that even the over 30 group has been critically affected by the radical changes around them, although they don't fully realize how it's happening. Dr. Winnick points out that even the staid businessmen are edging into patterned pastel-hued shirts and pants. Men's departments are doing a brisk business in jewelry, scented grooming aids, hairpieces, manicures, face creams, and colognes. Hairnets and permanent waves are discreetly labeled with terms like trainers and hair processing. In his book, Dr. Winnick catalogs several hundred pages of items in our culture that have become neutralized, bland, and consequently boring. For example, parents are giving more and more interchangeable names to their children, such as Kim, Chris, Leslie, Jean, Lee, and Dana. He believes that the blurring of masculine and feminine distinctions is leading our society into deep trouble because people cannot cope with critical life situations until they're certain of their sexual identity. Unisex clothing is confusing them and creating serious emotional crisis for many. Socialist Winnick doesn't care how masculinity and femininity are defined as long as they are clearly defined. Quote, just about every combination of male and female role relationships can be healthy and effective except one in which roles are blurred. That's what he wrote in Medical Opinion and Review, a magazine for physicians. With both Bible writers and social experts focusing on unisex clothing as a factor in creating sexual confusion, what should be our own personal attitude toward this spreading vogue? As members of the Remnant Church, we have not been left without guidance on this matter. E.G. White commented on the biblical position in these words. In Testimonies, Volume 1, page 457, she said, I was referred to Deuteronomy 22:5. The woman shall not wear that which pertaineth unto a man, neither shall a man put on a woman's garment, for all that do so are an abomination unto the Lord thy God. There is an increasing tendency to have women in their dress and appearance as near like the other sex as possible, and to fashion their dress very much like that of men. But God pronounces it abomination. End of quotation. Now please notice that she called it abomination for women to fashion their dress much like that of men. So the issue for us is no longer whether the clothes are actually those of the opposite sex. They might be created for one sex only, but be fashioned like the opposite sex. Thus the influence could be to push the bisexuals or fringe homosexuals over the line into the confirmed camp. Now the question is raised, where should the line be drawn between the male and female styles of clothing? There seems to be no disagreement about wearing the actual clothing of the opposite sex. That's clearly forbidden, of course. There's apparently much disagreement about the degree of similarity which can exist without becoming an abomination. Now many are convinced that the typical pantsuit is already fashioned very much after that of men. But if it is not, how many small changes would it take to put it into the category of being so fashioned? At that point, Sister White said it would be an abomination. As the pantsuit collars widen and coat styles shift to become more and more masculine, would it be possible to detect the point of transition from stylish to abomination? Each month, as the popular pantsuits adapt slightly more to the unisex, Adventist women continue to buy theirs from the styles available. Finally, one small change could place them in the category of being, quote, fashioned very much like that of men, end quote. In harmony with his last day strategy of creeping in by degrees, Satan could lead the remnant church into the unisex camp just as he led so many into the miniskirt scandal. and it would be done in such a way that few would recognize where the little steps were leading. Remember the small hoops of Sister A? In the same innocuous manner, the pantsuits of women and the effeminate styles of men could bring weakness and shame to the remnant church. Many sincere Adventists believe that the spirit of prophecy condones the pantsuits fashion. The truth is that Sister White took the opposite position. She condemned it. The popular American costume of Mrs. White's day is described by her in these words. This is taken from Volume 1, page 465. It consists of a vest, pants, and a dress resembling a coat, and reaching about halfway from the hip to the knee. This dress I have opposed from what has been shown me as not in harmony with the Word of God." End quote. Now, in what respect does that dress differ from the modern pantsuit? She was describing almost exactly what we see being worn by the vast majority of women today, except that the dress coat is a bit shorter on today's version. Later, Sister White described the objections to that particular dress, which made it unacceptable. She saw in vision 3 companies of ladies pass before her. The second group was wearing the dress, which she described as the American costume. Here are her comments, quote, "The dress of the second class which passed before me was in many respects as it should be. The limbs were well clad. They were free from the burdens which the tyrant fashion had imposed upon the first class, but had gone to that extreme in the short dress as to disgust and prejudice good people and destroy in a great measure their own influence. This is the style and influence of the American costume, taught and worn by many at our home in Danville, New York. It does not reach to the knee. I need not say that this style of dress was shown me to be too short." End of statement. And by the way, that statement is taken from Present Truth and Review and Herald articles, page 73. Now the picture comes into clear focus. The dress, which was described as vest, pants, and a dress resembling a coat and reaching about halfway from the hip to the knee, was not acceptable because she said the dress did not reach to the knees. In other words, pants apparently were not objectionable if they were covered by a dress which came at least to the knees. This, of course, pantsuits do not do. So we have no reason to conclude that she would approve of today's version of the American costume, the pantsuit. She clearly stated, "I saw that God's order has been reversed and His special directions disregarded by those who adopt the American costume. I was referred to Deuteronomy 22:5. And that's taken from Testimonies, Volume 1, page 457. Now, it's true that some of the pantsuit blouses are distinctly feminine in their cut and style, while others are severely masculine. Many fine Christian women defend the wearing of the feminine type, and others who are just as dedicated see no harm in wearing the more masculine. Now, it's not the purpose of this study to designate some line between these two fashions which separates wrong from right. No one, as far as I can tell, would know where such a line should be drawn. Every Adventist sister should weigh the dangers involved in taking the first step that would encourage a unisex trend. Those tiny steps which Satan uses to lead into the snare are often so innocent that they can be defended with righteous enthusiasm. It is truly difficult to debate the argument that pantsuits are more modest than many current dress styles. But in the light of our knowledge about Satan's modus operandus, and the lesson of the good wheat and quails, we should ask, where would it lead us? Would it be a step closer to the abomination that Sister White referred to? And would it give encouragement to Sister B to make her pantsuit just a little more mannish? And what about Sister C, who would go a step further? And they, along with every other lady who wears them, all the while protesting they're not wearing masculine clothes at all. This is the chapter entitled Colorful Cosmetics and Jewelry from the book Creeping Compromise. One of the most frequent and mistaken complaints that people make against religion is that it's too restrictive. In this permissive age, when all the emphasis seems to be upon doing your own thing, an unreasonable attitude of self-will has developed. This attitude has even intruded into religion. Church members and non-church members seem to be in quest of the same thing, a religion which doesn't interfere with personal rights and freedom. Suspicion is immediately aroused against any doctrine which demands the giving up of anything. As this liberal spirit has grown stronger, many church members have turned more and more critical of the high spiritual standards upheld by the church. Obviously embarrassed by the widening gap between the church and the world, and unwilling to meet the social stigma of being a peculiar minority, these members have sought to justify their compromise in the area of Christian standards. They often argue that the church is being narrow and legalistic, and that many fine people are being discouraged from joining the church by this arbitrary imposition of rules, as they put it. If these complaints are valid, then some basic changes surely need to be made in the doctrine of the church. If they're not valid, then we desperately need to know how to present the standards of Christian conduct and their true biblical setting. In other words, we must definitely establish whether these rules were made by God or by the church. We must also find out if they're arbitrary prohibitions or God's loving regulations for our own happiness. In contrast to the popular revolt against any absolute law of individual conduct, we must consider the Bible facts about the Christian life in general and morals in particular. How compatible are these modern demands for personal freedom with the standards of God's Word? Let's suppose that the true biblical position could be presented with all the love and persuasion of an angel from heaven. Would the truth be easy for anyone to accept? Let's face it, the path to eternal life is not a soft, flowery way of ease. Jesus laid such emphasis upon this in so many texts that we can't be blind to it at all. He said in Matthew 7:14, "Strait is a gate, and narrow is a way which leadeth unto life, and few there be that find it." One of the very first principles of being a Christian is self-denial. Jesus said, "If any man will come after me, let him deny himself, and take up his cross daily, and follow me." Luke 9:23. To be a Christian involves complete surrender. Our Lord's parable of the pearl and the merchantman reveals that we must be willing to invest every single thing we have in obtaining that tremendous prize of eternal life. If we allow one thing or one person to come between us and doing the will of Christ, we cannot be saved. Have we been guilty of discounting the price of discipleship so that people will not feel that the path is too narrow and restrictive? Jesus said, "Whosoever he be of you that forsaketh not all that he hath, he cannot be my disciple." Luke 14:33. The rich young ruler was told by Jesus that he lacked only one thing in his preparation for heaven, but that one thing he was not willing to do. He would have to surrender his wealth in order to be saved, but he was not willing to give it away. He loved something more than he loved the Lord, and he went away sorrowful and lost. The position of Christ was so strong on this point that he even said, "He that loveth father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he that loveth son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me." Matthew 10:37. Now I believe that we should search for the kindest, most tactful and loving way to present the claims of Christ to men and women. But I also believe that it will make little difference how it's presented if individuals have no love for the Lord Jesus. The fault does not lie with the message. Some of the fault lies with the preachers and the way they present it, but much of the fault lies in the attitude of the complaining Christian who feels rebellious against the truth because it requires a degree of self-denial. Let me illustrate how personal feelings and attitude can make all the difference in the world. Marriage is the most restrictive experience that any human being can voluntarily assume in this world, aside from his spiritual commitment to Christ. The man promises to surrender many of his former attachments and practices. He yields up his freedom to date other girls and solemnly binds himself to that one and only for the rest of his life. The bride also makes similar restrictive pledges and agrees to forsake all others in her devotion to the man at her side. The wedding vows are undoubtedly among the most narrow, rigid commitments any human being can make in this lifetime. Now, if restrictions and rules are the cause of so much misery, then weddings should be the most miserable, unhappy experiences for all concerned. But not so. They are the happiest events. Why? Why is the bride so radiant as she stands up to pledge her very life away to the groom? How can the man be so happy to make the promises which will inhibit his activities for the rest of his life? The answer is simple. They love each other. It's their attitude and feeling toward each other that makes the restrictions a joy to accept. Have you ever heard a bride complaining after the ceremony? Probably no one has ever heard her say bitterly, "Now I can't date Jim and Andy anymore. It's not fair. The state is forcing me to be faithful to my husband. This marriage business is too restrictive." No, you've not heard that. Neither have you heard a new bridegroom complaining that he's now compelled to give part of his salary to support his wife. True, the law demands that he do it under penalty of imprisonment, but he's not even conscious of the law. State law is ready to convict the bride if she commits adultery, but she doesn't even think of such a law. They are in love, and love changes everything. They're not being faithful because of fear of punishment. They're being faithful because they want to please the person whom they love so deeply. The most miserable men and women in this world are the ones who are married and no longer love each other. Here is almost literally hell on earth. They chafe and complain about the restrictions and impositions upon them. Similarly, the unhappiest church members in all the world are those who are married to Christ through baptism and yet do not love Him. They are often bitterly blaming the church and their instructors for imposing upon them their narrow, restrictive religion. But is it the religion or the pastors who are at fault? The sad fact is that those people have never entered that personal love relationship which is a cornerstone of all true religion. Many of them have learned the right text for the Bible study course and are quite able to explain the order of last-day events, but they have had no personal encounter with Jesus Christ. Somewhere, and perhaps everywhere along the lines of the indoctrination, they were not taught or did not choose to accept the true basis of heart religion. It's not a set of rules or a list of doctrines, but a deeply personal involvement in a love affair with the man Jesus Christ. The difficulty with millions of Christians is their motive for being church members. They have a fire escape religion. They do certain things only because they're afraid of the fire at the end of the road. They serve the Lord fearfully because they tremble at the thought of being cast into that lake of fire. No wonder they are long-faced and miserable. What a perversion of the truth. Christians should be the happiest people in the world, happier even than the newlyweds as they leave the wedding chapel. The Christian should love the Lord even more than husband or wife. Do you think a home could be happy if the wife prepared her husband's favorite dish each day because she feared he might divorce her? Earthly relationships even would collapse under this strain. She prepares that dish because she loves her husband and wants to please him. When his wife's birthday approaches, a loving Christian husband often watches and listens for an indication of what his wife would like to have. And usually, by the way, she doesn't have to hit him over the head to let him know. And he gladly buys her that gift because he loves her and wants to please her. In the same way, the Christian will be searching the Bible daily to discover ways of pleasing the Lord. He will constantly be looking for signs and indications of how to please the one he loves supremely. In the 20th century translation of the Bible, we read these words in Ephesians 5, verse 10, "Always be trying to find out what best pleases the Lord." What a motto for every Christian. Indeed, this is the supreme desire of those who love the Lord sincerely. No wonder Christ summarized that first table of the law in these words, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment." Matthew 22, 37 and 38. The real reason some Christians chafe and complain about the rules and the strictness is because they've only enough religion to make them miserable. The scope of their Christian experience is based upon a constant struggle to live up to the rules, an effort to keep the law. Now, certainly there's nothing wrong with obeying the commandments of God any more than there is with a husband obeying the state law to support his wife. But if the demands of the law are the only reason for obeying it, then something is seriously wrong with the Christian and with the husband. Love lifts the legal load and makes delightful what could be a burden and strain. A mother of 3 boys was having a terrible struggle trying to enforce the laws of good grooming and cleanliness. Like most little boys, these 3 resisted the rules about washing ears, combing hair, and shining shoes. It was a daily battle which Mother won only through the long arm of authority and force. But one day the oldest boy, in his early teens, walked out of his room looking the model of impeccable neatness. Every hair seemed to be exactly the right place, and the shoes below the well-turned cuff were shining to perfection. The mother almost fainted. Hardly able to suppress her surprise and delight, she wisely decided to wait and watch for the answer to this turn of events. The solution to the puzzle was not long in coming. The very next day, Mother learned that a new family had moved in down the block. And there was a girl in the family. Now, perhaps that girl had not seen Johnny, but he had already seen her and it had profoundly affected him. We'll not say that it was love which changed his attitude toward the laws of good grooming, but he definitely wasn't cleaning up from fear of mother's enforcement any longer. The point is that the Christian life is not composed of just do's and don'ts. There are restrictions, to be sure, in this spiritual marriage, just as there are in physical marriage. But those restrictions are imposed by love, which seeks always and ever to please the object of the affections. Those Christians who are in love with Christ are exuberant, beaming witnesses that this is the way of true happiness. Unfortunately, there's a larger group of church members who are miserably enduring what should be blissfully enjoyed. They are bitter and complaining about not being able to eat what they please or dress as they wish to. They blame the church for their being forced to give up so many things. Their religion seems much like the man with a headache. He didn't want to cut off his head, but it hurt him to keep it. Their joyless attitude seems to assume that their religion is the product of some committee of gloomy preachers bent on including all the prohibitive rules that could make men, women, and young people unhappy. But is this true, friends? What about the spiritual principles which make up the doctrine which we call Christian standards? Is it an arbitrary church law that one should not attend the theater? Is it God's decision or man's decision that dancing is improper for a Christian? And what about the use of colorful cosmetics and jewelry? Is it pleasing to God or displeasing? The truth is that every point of our faith and doctrine should be based soundly upon the principle of doing God's will as revealed in the Bible. Love for Him will always provoke the question, how can I always be trying to find out what best pleases the Lord? The answer to that question is found in scores of Bible texts which give indications and clear signals on how to please Him rather than ourselves. This is the only really relevant question concerning any activity or practice. What does God think about it? It doesn't matter what this preacher or that preacher thinks of it or what this church or that church believes about it. The great, all-important question is this: is it pleasing or displeasing to the Lord? If we find a text which reveals that God doesn't approve, there should be no further debate with a genuine Christian. We love Him too much to risk displeasing Him. Our delight should be to find and execute those things that please the one we love, and to eliminate from our lives those things that displease Him. When people are in love, they do not need to threaten each other or lay down ultimatums. They constantly search for ways to show their love and to please one another. Those who fulfill the first and great command of Christ will not feel it a burden to obey. God is searching for those who will be sensitive to the slightest indication of His will. He is not pleased by those who must be constantly prodded into line by fear of punishment. God says in Psalm 32:8 and 9, I will instruct thee and teach thee in the way which thou shalt go. I will guide thee with mine eye. Be ye not as the horse or as the mule, which have no understanding, whose mouth must be held in with bit and bridle, lest they come near unto thee. Now, many Christians are bit and bridle followers. They respond only to threats and obey because of fear of punishment. God says, I want you to be corrected by a look from me. Only those who love Him supremely and are watching for indications of His pleasure will recognize the loving glance of correction. Searching the Bible with one purpose, to discover what pleases Him, they will immediately obey the slightest revelation of His will. This is the essence of true Christianity, ordering every level of life in harmony with His revealed will because of love.